Hello and welcome. I'm Laura Olson for the United Nations International Training and Research Institute for the Advancement of Women. I'm here with Bridget Wooding from the Faculty for Social Science Research in Latin America, who's here to speak to us about studying migration from a gender perspective and about her work in the field. Bridget has more than 20 years living and working in the Caribbean and has worked with organizations such as Oxfam, ActionAid, Save the Children, and the Lutheran World Service. Welcome, Bridget. Thank you so much for being here with us.
First off, can you tell us the importance of studying migration from a gender perspective?
Yes, indeed. It's so important because of the 190 million migrants in the world today, half are women. Additionally, in Latin America and the Caribbean, in recent decades, more and more women are migrating. And what happens is that women in the workplace are often discriminated against. They suffer problems of harassment, they suffer problems of violation of the labor code. And this has meant that researchers have found that it's absolutely indispensable to study migration from a gender perspective, so that the gendered nature of settlement patterns is taken into account, so that the gendered nature of the labour market is taken into account, and the way indeed in which individuals or groups take their decision to migrate.
Perhaps you can give us an example of how men and women experience the migratory process differently.
Yes, take the Dominican Republic, the country that we're in at the moment. In the 80s, women in the south of the country began migrating in great numbers to Spain. And what they found when they sent money back to their menfolk, their partners who were in the Dominican Republic, was that the men weren't using the money for those ends which the women had hoped for. And so what they started to do was instead send the money back through the women, their aunts, their sisters, their grandmothers, to ensure that the money was spent on health, education, needs which they perceived to be priority ones.
You mentioned earlier that there's very little migration research that considers gender, and I understand that of that small amount of literature, most of it focuses on south-north migration flows. However, your research project is looking at south-south migration. Can you tell us a bit more about this project?
Yes, indeed. It's a regional project which has been funded through Canadian cooperation. It's been coordinated by the University of Windsor in Canada. And what we're looking at is 5 different contexts in Latin America and the Caribbean. We're looking at the situation of Peruvian women in Chile, of Bolivian women in Argentina, Nicaraguan women in Costa Rica, Guatemalan women in Mexico, and here on the island, Haitian women in the Dominican Republic. We're looking at 3 things particularly. In the first place, what knowledge do these women have of their rights? We're also looking at what's happening in terms of those key actors who may be accompanying them. And then what we're trying to do is to assess to what extent the advocacy strategies that are being used to advance their rights have been successful or not.
And what are the long-term goals of the project?
Yes, what we're trying to do is to make a contribution to migration studies and trying to make a contribution to social movement studies, and especially from the point of view of south-south migration, which has been little studied. And so what we're trying to do is to put more focus on the women migrant, which in the case of Latin America and the Caribbean has not been studied as much as in other geographical areas. And with a view particularly to seeing in what ways we can compare and contrast the 5 contexts to see what's similar, what's different, and how there can be horizontal learning as to how best to move forward.
And although the project is still in the second year of 3 years, are there any preliminary results that you can share with us, especially in terms of gender?
Yeah, the first year of the project we were really looking to see, analyze the actors accompanying the women. The second year of the project now, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be interviewing a sample of 50 women in each of the 5 contexts. What we found in the first year of the project was the international organizations, as one might expect, most involved with the issues were INSTRAW, UNIFEM, the International Migration Organization, UNICEF, to a lesser degree the International Labour Organization. Also the NGOs, the non-governmental organizations, obviously are extremely important in that accompaniment. Though what we found is that sometimes they may reinforce gender stereotypes which don't necessarily lead to the empowerment of the women. And as far as the trade unions are concerned, they're less present, and when they are present, they don't always work from a gender perspective.
And can you explain to us and to our viewers the legal framework that's responsible for protecting migrant workers?
Yes, there's quite a considerably robust international framework. The problem is that this isn't always respected at the domestic national level. Take, for example, the UN 1990 Convention on the protection of the rights of all migrant workers and their family members. If we look at the regional study that we're doing, most of the countries that are hosting migrants in the context of our regional study have indeed signed up to, have ratified this important convention, but unfortunately the Dominican Republic has yet to do so. At the same time, if we take the situation of the island, there are important agreements which have been reached across the island, for example, in terms of the way in which Haitians, undocumented Haitians, are repatriated to the Dominican Republic. The problem is that these agreements aren't always respected, and sometimes they don't correspond to best practices at the international level.
Perhaps you can comment a bit more on the situation on this island, the migration flow between Haiti and the Dominican Republic. I understand it's unique in that the border is relatively unregulated, migration is relatively unregulated.
Yes, there is a rather porous border. The situation is quite special here because we're talking about over a century of Haitian migration to the Dominican Republic, and especially in recent decades, this has been more and more unregulated, which is a problem. And even though the Dominican Republic attempted to adopt new migration legislation in 2004, they haven't really applied it as this might have been done, especially since it should have been prefaced by a process of regularization for those undocumented people who've been here for generations. Yes. And especially we need to take into account the vulnerability of migrant women who, because they work in those labor niches which are not very visible, are likely to be undocumented and likely to have their needs even less taken into account than their male migrant.
You mentioned earlier about Dominican women migrating to Spain to work in domestic service, and just recently about Haitian women migrating to the Dominican Republic to work in the same sector. Is there a relationship between these migration flows?
Yes, what we've seen, for example, in the south of the Dominican Republic with the considerable exodus of women is that Haitian women are coming in to those households to fill certain tasks that were being carried out by the Dominican women before, notably on care tasks. This is really the global care chain that we're seeing here, where the Haitian women are engaged especially in helping with elderly relatives or helping with young children.
And what, I guess, happens then to those who are left in Haiti?
Good question. It really is the end of the chain in that what we can see is the phenomenon of the so-called restavex. These are children, mainly girl children, who are in domesticity. That's to say they're poor families who've given away their children into slightly better off families in the hope that the children are going to be looked after, even though they recognize that they're going to be engaged in domestic service. Unfortunately, this often results in exploitative situations, such that today it's calculated that there are at least 300,000 children, mainly girl children, in really quite exploitative situation in domestic service in Haiti.
Mm-hmm. Can you tell us about FACSO's new project, the Observatory on Migration?
Yeah, we're very excited about this new project, the Observatory. Great. Basically what we're trying to do is, in collaboration with other researchers in the north and in the south, with relevant state officials, with other social organizations, what we're trying to do is to take a harder look at the dynamics of migration affecting the Caribbean. What we want to do in particular is to compile information that can be really used by policymakers in elaborating and applying policy, and at the same time give new tools to key civil society actors so that they can also be enabled to better promote the rights of migrants.
Excellent. It sounds like a wonderful initiative, and I wish you the best of luck with it. Can you tell us, just before we close, the risks of not considering gender when you're studying migration or writing migration policy?
Yes, indeed. And if we take some of the field work that we've done here on the island, for example, in the case of the way in which repatriations, deportations, undocumented Haitians are carried out, it's quite clear that not taking gender into account has meant that women are particularly disadvantaged because their specific needs are not taken into account. For example, pregnant women may be deported, or families may be separated. And this is not good because gender considerations really mean that just migration policy is not being applied.
Well, wonderful. Thank you so much, Bridget, for sharing your time and sharing information about your observatory. We'll be sure to be following it in the web. Is there a website address for us to follow?
Yes, there is indeed. It's www.obmica.org.
Great. Thanks very much, Bridget.
Thanks, that's my pleasure, and I want also to take the opportunity to wish you all the very best in the continuity that you're giving to the virtual community of practice, migration and gender. All the very best to INSTRAW for this excellent initiative.
Great. Thank you, Bridget.